Hello once again. I hope everybody's had a good night and is able to spend a little bit of time on this video in preparation for tomorrow's class. If you remember, we talked a lot about the nucleus and the function of the nucleus as it relates to eukaryotic cells. We talked a little bit about the specific components and what value they add to the cell and what are their roles are. If you remember, kind of progressing from this in our video, the cell has a variety of other components associated with it, and one of the other ones we talked about involved the cellular membrane or the plasma membrane. And if you remember, this was the component in our Eukaryopolis video that related to the police force in a city. This force, prevents certain things from entering the city and wants certain entities out of the city. Well, the plasma membrane, the cellular membrane, does much of the same. And if you look at this diagram, it's very helpful. We know that the membrane, the plasma membrane or the cellular membrane has two layers, and it's a phospholipid bilayer. And with that bilayer, it's easy to kind of explain it from a visual standpoint. You have on the top, these are called the hydrophilic heads. These heads are prone to interact with water. They want to interact with water, and therefore they're on both the outside and the inside of that plasma membrane, of that cellular membrane. And what you have on the inside of this layer is called the hydrophobic tails, and these tails have an aversion to water. They don't want anything to do with water. And if you remember, we used the term phobia to kind of kickstart that in class. Somebody that has arachnophobia is obviously afraid of spiders. So these tails, once again, don't want anything to do with the water of the environment in which the cell interacts in. And this equation down at the bottom, obviously there's a lot going on there. But what you have here in this long chain here is you have a hydrocarbon chain. And if you remember what we talked about lipids, those were an organic compound comprised of things like carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So when you think about lipids, think about an organic component associated with living things. In this case, we're talking about a living cell. So this hydrocarbon chain at the bottom here, this is referred to as the tail. And this tail is what you would associate with the hydrophobic tails in this diagram. The larger portion of the tail at the end is what you would classify as being the head. And you can see the hydrophilic head is at the top or the inside of each layer. And what that does, once again, remember, hydrophilic heads want to come into contact with water. If we take a look at this cross-section of a cell, obviously we can't see many of the components associated with it, but the cross-section explains this phospholipid bilayer in relation to what role the head has and what role the tails have. As you can see, the hydrophilic head, that's on the inside of the membrane as well, and that's one location in which it would come into contact with that water-based environment. And we'll talk a little bit about that environment during the next section. But once again, you can see on the outside of the cellular membrane or plasma membrane, the heads are also located. And once again, these want to come into contact with water. That's why they're located on the outside. And the inside of both layers is what we had when we talked about the hydrophobic tails. And remember, these tails have an aversion to water. They don't want anything to do with it. So once again, this diagram gives a representation of what a cross-section of a cell would look like and the role that each layer would play in relation to the water environment it's exposed to. Okay, our last slide depicts this whole relationship, and I think it's pretty good. You have a copy of this, and we had watched this in our introductory video. Once again, we'll go over this relationship in our notes, but you can see here they have the entire cell at the top here, and the arrow is pointing to what that bilayer would look like. And you can notice there's a lot going on in this diagram, and we're only going to focus on right now the things that are applicable to this topic. So you can tell on the outside you have an extracellular fluid. This would be a water-based environment within your body. Once again, your body is made up of roughly 70+% of water. So this would be the outer area of the cell. And on the inside here, we're talking about the cytoplasm, which is a water-based environment as well. And the cytoplasm we haven't talked about yet. That's where the majority of the organelles are housed, and we'll continue to work on that. But this cross-section here shows the relationship that we talked about. On both edges of the bilayer, on both sides of the cellular or plasma membrane, you can see that's where the heads are located, because once again, the hydrophilic heads want to come into contact with water. They're not afraid of it. They don't have a phobia against it. So these heads come into contact with water. And on the inside of that bilayer, you have your hydrophobic tails. So once again, as you remember, these tails don't want anything to do with water. So in essence, that bilayer keeps the water inside the cell and prevents any water from outside coming into the cell. So you can tell here from your diagram, the three components we need to focus on for tomorrow's class involves the polar heads of the phospholipid molecule. And we'll talk about the polar and nonpolar relationship tomorrow a little bit, so don't concern yourself with that too much. But you know for a fact that the polar heads of the phospholipid molecule are located both on the outer and inner side of the cellular membrane. You can see that right there, and there's some located here at the bottom. All right, you have the bimolecular lipid layer, and that contains certain proteins. We'll talk about those proteins tomorrow. We'll continue to build upon that. And then here in the middle, you have the nonpolar tails of the phospholipid molecule. So once again, this diagram shows the extracellular fluid, or the watery based environment outside of the cell, and the cytoplasm, which we'll continue to talk about, which is the water based environment inside of the cell, and what role the bilayer phospholipid membrane plays in relation to that relationship. One of the key things we'll talk about as well, dealing with this, and we'll continue to talk about it, is selective permeability. And another role of this layer is to allow certain things into the cell, to prevent certain things into the cell, and once again to allow things that are in the cell to leave the cell. So that's another major component that we'll address. So hopefully this helped a little bit. We'll spend some time on this tomorrow. Once again, hopefully this just gives you a foundation to work on for tomorrow. If you have any questions, let me know. We'll see you tomorrow in class. Thanks.